Only 14 of these Swiss cheese Pontiacs were built in 1963 before General Motors pulled the plug on their factory racing program, and this one is by far the most famous example as it was raced by Arnie Beswick, a legendary Pontiac racer from the 1960s and 70s. Let's take a look at what makes these cars so special and dig into the history of this particular car as it went through the years and passed through different owners and eventually ended up in a private collection in Georgia. I want to say a huge thank you to Dean Fate. He helped me gather some materials for this video, pictures and information that I wouldn't normally have been able to get. And the reason he has all these things stored away is that he wrote a book about Arnie Beswick's racing career. And this book is full of great pictures of all of Arnie's different cars and different configurations of each car and the story behind each one of them. So you should check that book out. I'm putting a link down in the description below. Definitely check it out. If you're into 60s and 70s drag racing, you'll enjoy it. So as the Superstock wars are raging, General Motors, Ford Motor Company, and Chrysler Corporation all had their own factory lightweight cars. So when the 1963 models rolled around, Pontiac took it to extremes by taking everything you could take away from a car, including structural integrity, and then putting their famous 421 Super Duty engine in this lightened full-size car. They put aluminum inner and outer fenders on the front. They put aluminum bumpers front and rear, aluminum bumper brackets, aluminum radiator support, and aluminum hood, and they even put aluminum things like the aluminum bell housing. Some of the cars even came with an aluminum center section for the rear end, and they even had aluminum exhaust manifolds, which took the weight down from 72 pounds with the cast iron manifolds to 27 pounds. So all 14 of these cars were silver in color. The first 12 were called Fire Frost Silver. That was actually a Cadillac color. The last two that were produced were Silver Mist Gray. All 14 of them were blue interior. All of them were radio delete. All of them were heater delete. They were stripped down to the bone. So let's take a quick moment to address the nickname Swiss cheese. Now these cars were lightened in many ways, including those aluminum fenders and aluminum body components, but Pontiac took it one step further by actually lightening the frame on these cars. These are full frame cars, and they typically would have a boxed rail. But instead of a boxed rail on these Swiss cheese cars, they would actually take one of the plates out, making it more of a U shape, and then they drilled more than 120 2 3/4 inch holes in the frame rails and basically every piece of the frame to lighten it up, taking metal away from it to lighten it up. So, you know, that took away some structural integrity. These cars weren't fit for use on the highway, but they were absolutely perfect for drag racing. Each car was a little bit different. Some of the cars had plexiglass windows, some of the cars had regular glass, some of the cars had the aluminum center section, some had a nodular iron, some of them had a cast iron 3-speed transmission, but the one we're looking at today, Arnie Beswick's car, was ordered with a T10 4-speed, so it had an aluminum case on the 4-speed. And then of course the special version of that 421 engine, this thing had 13-to-1 compression, it had a special McKellar cam, it had dual Carter AFB carburetors, and there was even a special tunnel ram style intake that was available over the counter. So these engines were really potent right out of the factory, but if you tuned on them and tweaked on them and did the normal Superstock tricks, you could get 500 plus horsepower out of these things, even though they were only rated for 405 horsepower. And to go back to the Superstock ranks in the 1960s, the class designations were split up by advertised horsepower. You could still squeak out several horsepower out of head work and things like that that would go unnoticed in the tech line. At 3,300 pounds, that would put you way down in the 12s in legal Superstock form. But a lot of these guys would match race these cars kind of in between national events. They would match race at different tracks, and the gloves were off. You could do whatever you wanted in a match race situation. Arnie Beswick got paid to show up and race other factory lightweight cars, AFX cars, Superstock cars, gassers, anybody that would line up against him. Some of these tracks would pay him appearance money to show up, plus whatever money he would get for winning the race. So this car actually ran down into the 11s in match race form and raced in the 12s in legal Superstock form. And that brings us to another point that's very special about this Arnie Beswick car. It actually has a different spindle on it than the other Swiss cheese Pontiacs. It's got a taller spindle which actually changes the geometry of the front suspension, which transfers weight to the rear tires. And then a special traction bar was added to the back of the car, which helped control the squad and helped really stabilize that rear end housing. This car and Arnie Beswick worked really well together and won a lot of races in 1963. If you're enjoying this video, do me a favor and hit that thumbs up button. Feel free to leave a comment below and hit the subscribe button if you haven't already. Through the years, Arnie Beswick had connections with Pontiac dealers all over the country. And you'll see in the early pictures of this 63 Catalina, it actually had Seltzer Pontiac lettered on the doors. And there's actually a little bit of confusion if you start researching Arnie Beswick's car. You might run into some pictures of Larry Johnson's car because they look very similar. Obviously they were all silver, but they look very similar because on the quarter panel it says Passionate Poncho. But on Larry Johnson's car it says Home of the Passionate Poncho, and on Beswick's car it says Mr. B's Passionate Poncho 3. So a little bit of confusion there and a little bit of a tie in there with Larry Johnson and the Johnson Pontiac dealership because they did come up with that Passionate Poncho name together a couple years before. On a side note, Larry Johnson's Catalina ended up getting cut up into an altered wheelbase car, so the long rear overhang on these cars got even longer with moving the rear axle forward. During this time, Arnie Beswick would drive to the track with two cars in tow. He would typically have a car for one class and a car for another class. And sometimes whether it was a match race or a national event or whatever, you know, if one car broke, he could still be in the game. Or, you know, it increased his odds of winning by having two cars. Even though General Motors pulled the plug on that factory drag racing program, Arnie continued to support Pontiac because that combination worked for him. But the reality was that drag racing was moving fast in 1963 and going into the 1964 season. The factory experimental class was evolving quickly, and then there was a whole new group of cars coming out that were supercharged, running on nitromethane, you know, dragster type driveline in a full-bodied car. These cars would eventually sort of mesh with the altered wheelbase AFX cars and become what we now know as funny cars. But during this time, I mean, things were changing really fast. And, you know, he moved on from this Catalina and he sold it to another drag racer. His name was Andy Perry. He was from DeWitt, Iowa, and he continued to race the car. It would still remain silver. And in this picture, you'll also see the back tire is off of the car, and you can see the holes in the frame rails, and you can also see an extensive traction bar system on the rear suspension on this car. So Andy ended up selling the car to Ray Bizig from the Chicago area, and he ended up putting a really unique combination in this car, and he continued to drag race it for several years. And he had a D-stroked engine in here that was pretty small in cubic inches. It was only 319 cubic inches as listed on the fender here. And this thing would launch super hard. I mean, look at this launch picture. This thing's got all the front suspension droop that you could ever want because of those special spindles. Even though this car had been updated slightly, it was still pretty true to its roots. It hadn't really been cut up or anything. A lot of those factory lightweight components were still intact. Some of those old suspension pieces were still intact, including those special spindles. But the only thing that had been added here was a roll bar, which is still in this car to this day. That hasn't been taken out of it. But, you know, this car remained a really significant piece of drag racing history because the different owners through the years, they didn't get rid of those factory lightweight components. They didn't cut up the back of the car as far as putting huge tires under the back. They didn't do very much as far as changing this very significant car. So fast forward a few years and Ray puts this car up for sale, and Bill Blair, who's a Pontiac enthusiast, he's built Pontiac racing engines, he's been around Pontiacs his whole life, he ended up making a deal with Ray on this car and bought it in 1987. At that point, Bill put the lettering back to the way it used to be. Aside from Arnie Beswick's name, he left that off for a few years. He put his name on the windows because he was actively racing this car at Nostalgia Drag Races. And this thing was running deep down into the 11s. I mean, this car, he was beating on it. He was running it hard. Eventually, the racing kind of fizzled out, and he just held on to this car for quite a few years. He had another significant Pontiac lightweight drag car, and these two cars just kind of fit together. But eventually, he sold the car to Jerry Kelly from Adel, Georgia. He has a collection of pretty significant cars as well, and I was able to see this car up close and personal at the Savoy Auto Museum in Cartersville, Georgia. They had a special exhibit on factory drag cars, and it was amazing. There was some cars there that I had never seen before, including this Swiss cheese car. I'd never seen a Swiss cheese car in person. Not many people have. I hope you enjoyed following along with me. Thank you for watching.